All right, we're good.
Good afternoon, Detachment 842. My name is Cadet Murphy, and today I have with you a very distinguished guest, retired Lieutenant Colonel Mr. Springer. How are you doing today, Mr. Springer?
Doing fine.
My name is Cadet Murphy, and today I have with you
the rest of the detachment.
I'm fantastic. It's Friday, and we only have a week left of school, so we are all extremely excited here to be almost done with our semester. We've really pushed out, and I know that we have a lot of FDP cadets that are ready to go to Shelby. So it's a little bit different than Maxwell this year, so a lot different. So that's going to be so exciting for them. I think you actually went to Shelby at one point, sir, right?
Shelby
Air Force Base?
No, I haven't been.
You just went to Maxwell?
Yeah, I just went to Maxwell for Squadron Officer School and Air Command and Staff College.
Wow. Well, Mr. Springer, today we're going to ask you a couple questions, but you are a weather officer. You served in the Air Force for 25 years, and now you are currently a professor at the University of McCarran Ward in weather. So how was that transition from military to civilian life for you?
It took a little getting used to. Before I got to UIW, I was a high school science teacher for 6.5 years. So I had a little transition period there. So, but they kind of warned us when we went through our out processing for the Air Force during retirement to kind of expect that and what to look for and not to expect the same kind of conditions as the Air Force.
Yes, sir. Yes, I totally understand. Well, today we're going to kind of focus on your career as a weather officer. And I know that from a lot of experience I have just within this own detachment, a lot of people have really no idea what a weather officer actually does. You know, they kind of expect us to just read a prompt, but not really knowing the science, the physicals, the physics and the chemistry that kind of goes behind it. So can you kind of tell us like what a weather officer's day is like, how it's different from the general perception, and I'm also working with joint to joint branching because I know that weather officers also provide their services across the board on the military.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I have one slide that I like to have shown, and let me go and share that real quick. There we go. Get it up there. Okay, and hopefully everyone can see the slide now.
It looks like it's loading, sir.
Okay. That's the one thing you have to, whenever you're, especially as a weather officer, but it's true about any officer in any career field. With today's technology, you have to be flexible and have a plan B in case your first plan does not work. Is it showing up now, Cadet Murphy?
No, sir. It looks like it's still loading. I mean, maybe if you click a couple buttons, because I see something on there, but yeah, it's not showing like the pictures.
Okay, we just had it up a minute ago, didn't we?
Yes, we did, sir.
Okay, let me stop sharing and reshare. Sometimes
yes,
like I said, flexibility, they always say the key to air and space power is flexibility. This is the perfect example.
Yes.
You just don't get too excited. You just
okay. It was up now.
It's up now. Okay. So there we go. Now, did the second slide come up? Should be 3 blank boxes, basically.
3. Yes, it's 3 blank boxes.
Okay, and that's not surprising your perception because I had the same perception. I was going into the weather field, and even when I went through my basic meteorology training, which was at St. Louis University for 10 months, I didn't realize that Air Force weather did as much as it did. And the connections with the other services that you mentioned and with other countries' weather services. And so that was a real eye-opening through my 25 years of service. But generally as a brand new lieutenant, as a weather officer, you're going to be working at the base or the post level. You're working on a combat weather team, you're briefing pilots. So those cadets who are pilots or pilot candidates, I'll say, you're going to see a lot of the weather team. And when I talk about the weather team, it's really more than just the officers. It's officers, enlisted, civilians, and even some contractors, because the actual Air Force weather is relatively small. Up in that little box in the upper right-hand corner, we only have 526 weather officers as of September 2019. about 2,900, just a little over 2,900 enlisted. That makes up about 1% of the entire Air Force. So we're not a real big career field, but
No,
we
sir.
do a lot. We get spread around a lot. 20% of that force is working with the Army directly. We're not assigned to an Air Force base. We're assigned to an Army post. So that means when the Army goes out on field maneuvers, you go out with the Army and do the same thing the Army do. Guard duty, just like that, looks like one sergeant with the weapon, another, probably a weather officer taking some observations for winds or pressures or temperatures with some tactical gear. You live in tents, you do everything the Army does there. And then there's even a smaller branch that go through some special training that learn how to work with the special forces, and they learn how to parachute out of aircraft, they rappel out of helicopters, they go through all the survival training, escape and evasion, because their work takes them behind the enemy lines to take weather observations. So the perception that the weather career field or the weather officer is a person looking at the screen and just kind of answering some very simple questions, you get out and you actually do and work with the operators, so to speak, whether it's the Army, the Special Forces, or with the air crews. So that's something that normally you do as a young lieutenant.
Wow, that's like a lot to kind of digest within your first couple of years in the Air Force.
Yeah, and you're given these opportunities to kind of maybe do some work with the pilots for a year or two, and then you might get reassigned to an Army unit. And then there's always a request out for if you want to go special ops. And I knew several of my friends who did that, and they just thoroughly enjoyed it. All my work with special ops were more in garrison, more typical base level. I didn't jump out of airplanes. I didn't think that would be my cup of tea, so to speak.
It's not for everybody. That is
It's not for everyone. Yeah. I like my rides in the airplane to be inside the airplane and not
and only staying
early.
inside. Yeah, I agree. I couldn't. I'm not a big person. I'm not going to be jumping out of planes or something like that. So I probably would be more preferred in, assisting from afar is probably where I would want to be too.
But that's an exciting area of Air Force weather. In fact, if you go through the training, they wear special hats and special badges. They wear the gray beret, indicating that they're jump qualified.
Wow. I didn't even, these are new, you learn new things every day. So
you do. Yeah, you do. And then as you move out of the base level, you move up into the weather central and specialized units. The Global Forecast Center is called the 557th Weather Wing at Offutt Air Force Base. And they're responsible for making products, weather products for around the world, including the areas over oceans where the pilots are flying from the US to, say, Europe or to Asia to Southwest Asia. They're responsible for creating all the forecasts, and you work on teams there. As you can see over on the left side there, two team members are conversing about the weather and what to put on the weather charts for forecasting. And we also have some smaller regional forecast centers called operational weather squadrons. And a lot of the young enlisted start there, and then they move on to these combat weather teams once they get a little more experience. Now, there's some specialized weather teams. One of them is the space weather forecast team, and that's one of the areas that is my specialty. My master's degree is in space physics from UCLA, and my first job out of UCLA was as a team chief of a 3-person team forecasting solar flares, sunspots, geomagnetic storms, and the impact of those environmental effects on satellite and communications. So there, I had to know a lot about the science, the electromagnetic spectrum. As you can see in the background where the young lady is pointing, that's the sun in different views, looking at different spectrums of the radiation. And each of those images represents some different data, and you have to understand what that data is telling you so you can forecast the sun and any kind of impacts that sun storm will have on our satellites. And you sometimes only have 8 minutes from the time the event occurs on the sun to that X-ray radiation reaching the Earth's atmosphere and causing blackout of radios, impacts on satellites. So it can be kind of a high pressure, very rapid work in that field.
Yeah, and I mean, and a lot of people really don't know the science behind it. So I'm happy that you brought up how solar radiation definitely impacts all levels of, satellites, because I mean, it's just not our weather satellites that also get impacted. It's all of them up there. And exactly. I cannot recollect how many satellites are roughly in the atmosphere right now.
Oh, I've lost count. It's in the thousands. And then plus you have all the commercial satellites. We don't worry about the commercial satellites. What we have is a space forecast center with the National Weather Service. And a lot of our products out of the military space forecast center are co-products, meaning that we put together these products together with our counterparts in the National Weather Service. So there's a lot of communication between the military and the National Weather Service Space Forecast Center. So as a young officer, I began to get the connections working with other federal agencies.
Yeah, and nobody really knows. I mean, weather is a lot of hand-to-hand contact with different businesses and sponsorships. And so they have no idea that we work so much with like NOAA and the Storm Prediction Center. They have no idea that, the military and especially the Air Force plays a huge part in decimating information and getting our own information. And, like we have a big responsibility as weather officers. I remember you telling us it's not just life, it's also property as well of the Air Force. And we need to know when to move those big, planes, and we need to know when to assist with the Navy and stuff like that. So every day as, a weather officer could really be different.
Exactly. And then there's the other end of that. Once to get those satellites up into the orbits that they need to be in, we have two teams, one team at Patrick Air Force Base near Cape Canaveral, and another one at Vandenberg Air Force Base, where these officers are part of the Space Launch Weather Team. So before they can launch any kind of satellite or a manned craft now, is that they have to go through an extensive checklist to go through the winds aloft, the electromagnetic field, so there's not going to be a discharge of lightning that could destroy the rocket as it goes up. And these officers can actually stop the launch of a satellite or a manned spacecraft with only a few minutes left before launch time. So we work closely with not only the Air Force component at Patrick and Vandenberg, but we also work with NASA there at Cape Kennedy, because it's a joint team there that works that aspect of it. So that's a whole different realm of work that a space weather officer could be doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, fairly high pressure, especially if they're trying to get a satellite off in a certain time. These launches, sometimes when I was on the Air Force's Air Force's weather satellite team, I was an acquisition officer, and we were launching or trying to launch the new satellite, and we got within about 5 seconds before we scrubbed because of a mechanical problem. But wow. There was a lot of pressure on to get these up because we only had a window of 5 minutes. If you go outside the window, the satellite is useless.
Yeah, no, and that's, nobody even knows that. I mean, especially because I think it has a lot to do with air traffic too. I mean, it has to get to a certain orbit and then it has to circulate. So can you explain that process of what happens when a satellite is after it's launched, what it kind of goes through?
Yeah, when you launch it, and this is where my experience as an acquisition officer, because I'm dual qualified both as a weather officer and an acquisition officer, and this is where it really helps by having my weather background with that one job. I would send a team out to the launch facility, and they will start the initial checking out of the sensors. So they would be looking at the initial data coming in, which would be weather data. And I would have to kind of help them understand why that is so important, that we have to be very precise and accurate with that data that's coming in with those sensors to know whether they're calibrated right, or if we need to have the contractor come in and make some calibration adjustments to those sensors. Otherwise, the data that we're getting at these weather centrals or back down to the combat weather teams is pretty much useless.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it really does involve so many different hands, from maintenance to us to the people that are working in the actual centers, making sure it's going to get up there, and just like a lot of moving parts, And, anything can go wrong. And, that's, I think I remember you saying that it's, several $1 million for just one satellite. So you want to do it the right way, and you don't want to take any shortcuts. So that's extreme. So
I always told my new lieutenants and young captains when I was in the acquisition of that satellite program, is when you're doing this with aircraft, the aircraft can just circle around and land. When you're launching a rocket, you get one chance. Once those engines go, that vehicle is off for space.
Find out who that is.
Yeah.
If it doesn't make it to space, it's coming back down into the ocean.
Absolutely.
So take the work seriously, whether you're in any of your career fields that you're involved in. And then the final thing I have is more of the staff positions. Working at air staff, I did have a tour up at the air staff. I was in the weather policy. But you can also work at the MAJCOMs. There's weather officers there doing the planning and the equipping of the weather teams to deploy forward. There's other jobs within defense agencies. I had a job in a special weapons agency working on a space weather model. Again, another acquisition type job. And then when I was in the Pentagon, I was working with several weather groups, including going over to Europe to NATO, and working with our allies from all the NATO countries. In fact, the weather community had the first meeting with the Hungarians who had just joined NATO. So the first NATO meeting by the Hungarians was a weather group meeting, and I got to attend that as the Air Force representative. I also worked with the Canadian military weather teams. And so you got a lot of international once you get into the higher levels.
Wow, that's a lot of public relations there.
Yes, you got to know how to do, because each country has a different culture and different way and view of how to handle things. So you kind of have to be kind of sensitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and I'm sure in a room full of people, sometimes that can be a bit overwhelming, especially when you have these time restraints. And for us, it's like it's providing, data. And I can only imagine that feeling. And I'm not excited for it myself when I become a weather officer, to be like, man, I have all these important people and I have to brief them, and, and they're expecting me to be right. And that's a big stressor,
Yep.
So, but let's go into, you said that you worked in the space weather forecasts and you were doing with the typhoons warning center. Can you tell me a little bit about that, like that job that you had?
Yeah, when I was a young captain out at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, which is no longer there, I was there before the volcano. So that's usually a question I always get. But I was there for the revolution. But my prime job was as a satellite analyst, and you can see the satellite image there on the bottom there. I would take those satellite images, and using various techniques, I would estimate the wind speed of the typhoon based on the cloud pattern. And then I would forecast, or actually predict, where the center is by using other techniques to do the measurement. So at the time, we had both aircraft going in, which are the hurricane hunters that you see the major there sitting at the console inside the WC-130. But toward the end of my career at Clark, we no longer had the aircraft. They disbanded that group, and we were using completely satellite imagery to position and estimate the wind speeds of these typhoons as they formed in the Western Pacific.
Wow. I mean, I mean, so like, was that like a long job or how long were you there for?
I was there for 3.5 years.
So you got pretty good towards the end.
I would see out in the Western Pacific, you average about 30 typhoons a year. I would do about 300 fixes a year myself. And then my team would do another about 200 or 300. And then I would do quality checks on all their fixes, which means I would do a refix of the storm to make sure that my training of them of how to do the techniques were still proper.
And how many branches of military were you working with at that time?
There at Clark, I was at an Air Force base. I'd be calling my stuff back to my positions and my data back to the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, which was a joint Navy Air Force, where you had typhoon duty officers made up of both Air Force weather officers and Navy weather officers. And when I was at Clark, I also would be working with the Navy weather teams down at Subic and Cubic Bay, which was just to the southwest of Clark, to coordinate our actions for when a typhoon would be approaching the Philippine Islands.
Wow, that's like quite a bit. And so I know that we have kind of talked about this in the background, but some of our students do want to know, you also have a wife that served in the Air Force as well, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And she was also a retired, well, now she's also a retired Lieutenant Colonel Springer.
Yep. We met in ROTC. We began to date, what was it, junior year? We held off getting married for 1 year until we got on active duty and got things settled, because I had a school that I had to attend after my commissioning, because I did not have a degree in meteorology. I have a bachelor's degree in aeronautics and a Bachelor of Arts in Aeronautical Math. So I had to go off to a 10-month program at St. Louis University to get all my meteorology courses taken care of in 10 months. And then we were able to get reassigned, or I got reassigned down to Kelly Air Force Base, and she was at Randolph Air Force Base here in San Antonio.
Wow. Okay. And so with your career progressing and her career progressing, I mean, what job did she have?
She started out as an operational analyst. So she was actually working for Air Training Command, and they were looking at how we were training officers and how we were training enlisted and making recommendations on how to improve that training, or if two career fields were very close in doing the same type of work, whether to merge those to save the Air Force money on training and to have one career field. So she was traveling around, literally around the world, doing surveys and doing these studies.
Wow. So, I mean, both of you had a pretty hectic career, especially for the first couple of years. And so what kind of stressors does that kind of put on a relationship and a marriage? I mean, it's going to be hard to be separated.
Yeah, we kind of knew that was going to be the case. So we had long discussions before we got married about that, and about what we would do if, certain things would happen, like we couldn't get assigned together, what would be acceptable and not acceptable. So we kind of had that kind of mapped out. And every time we would come up for reassignment, we knew that would be about a year away from, the actual time. So we'd begin to talk to the various career people at the personnel center and see what they needed and what we could fill. Yeah. And then the best advice that we were ever given, and what we kind of learned by trial and error, I guess, is to be extremely flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that you've had numerous jobs. I mean, you said it, you were in acquisitions, you were a weather officer, and I'm assuming that has a lot to do with, being in close proximity to your wife as well.
That's exactly right. I have actually 3 different career fields. I have the meteorologist as my main, or my primary. My secondary is acquisition. And then I had a third career as a scientific officer. And that's when I was working for the Defense Agency. And I took each of those careers so we could be stationed close together. She has 5 different career fields that she's worked in. Now, they're all related. Her primary is acquisition, which gave us a lot of flexibility. But she's been an exec officer, a comm communication officer. I kind of lose track of all of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, it sounds like she's a jack of all trades, and there's nothing wrong with that. The Air Force needs a lot of people that are very versatile and very diverse to kind of fill the jobs that they need. And we get told all the time, especially right now, in our detachment, we just had our PSP selection and we just went up for the rated board. So I think a lot of our cadets are learning, and our 400s basically that are graduating, they just got their jobs last semester.
All right. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. We've been doing a lot here at Detachment A42, but I think a lot of us are learning that, the needs of the Air Force, they try to cater to everybody, especially with our degrees, but sometimes, you just get stuck with jobs that you just never thought you would have. And it's not saying that you can't go into those other fields later on, but you have to kind of be, that jack of all trades. You have to be able to take on new positions that you just never thought you were going to have. So
exactly. And if I can interrupt and give two examples of that, being flexible, and I think this fits it fits for almost any career field, and whether you're joint spouse or not, is we wanted a Europe trip assignment so bad coming out after our first assignment down here at Randolph and at Kelly. And so we went to talk to the personnel center, and they said, well, there's just nothing open in Europe for weather because we're reducing our footprint, our size of the units in. So there's nothing in Europe. How about the Pacific? So they offered us Okinawa. So we went to talk to her career people who make the assignments. And they said, well, there's nothing in Okinawa for my wife, but how about the Philippines? So we traced back over to the weather assignment team. And they said, yeah, we have 3 officers leaving. When did you want to go? So we had an assignment a year in advance. My wife actually had orders a year in advance of going to the Philippines.
Wow.
That's being flexible.
I would definitely say that that's being flexible, but I mean, you made it work and you were able to stay together, and that's really all that matters,
And we met the Air Force's need. They needed 3 weather officers. I filled one of them. They needed a captain who was knowledgeable about computers. My wife had a computer science background, met the Air Force's needs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And a second story real quick is when I got reassigned after UCLA, I was going off to Omaha, Nebraska to off it to the, it wasn't called the 557th Weather Wing at that time, but they didn't really have anything directly for her. So my wife took a job down, actually it was a lower position job that she had been working. And then about 6 months later, she went in to talk to wing commander and say, hey, I think I can do more for the wing here. Is there any openings in something else? And the colonel said, well, not really. But I do have this thing called TQM, Total Quality Management. And we're just starting this and really don't know much about it. And my wife perked up and she goes, oh, yeah, we were doing that back when we were in Los Angeles. And she immediately got hired by the colonel. The colonel leaves in about 9 months. The 2-star general hires her to bring her up to his staff. That general leaves in about a year. And then the 4-star general at Stratcom needs a total quality management expert and pulls her up to his staff. So within about 2-3 years, she was working down at the squadron level at a low-level job to now working for the 4-star general.
Wow, that's insane. And I mean, it kind of just caters to your wife's capabilities as well. I mean, if she wasn't good at her job, she wouldn't advance, but because she was phenomenal at her job, it just kept showing. And I mean, hard work is something that we definitely press into our cadets.
Good trait to press on, because that's what I look for when I was a squadron commander. Mm-hmm. And when I'd be hiring as a program manager, when they would bring in people and say, hey, would you like so-and-so on the team? I would look and I would take a look at, is there any initiative there? Do they know their material? More than just superficial. I mean, deeply know their material and how they fit into the role and the mission of the Air Force.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they press on us so much. Even I struggle, especially with memorandums and coming up with the documentation that the Air Force wants us to have and having it structured. But I mean, there is a reason behind that. I
Mhm.
mean, you want to have that paper trail. And, of course, everybody has an I Love Me book that I'm just now learning about, which is just like all your good things that you've done in the Air Force and, just having your package ready. So that way, in times when you have that job opening or when you have that assignment that's coming up or you have that promotion that's coming up, you'll be fully prepared and it will kind of, your work will show for itself. So I know that it
Exactly.
seems like it's terrible right now. And I'm just like, man, I can't believe I used the wrong font or I can't believe I did that. It has a reason behind it. And so hopefully our GMC kind of take their knowledge, even if it is learning how to do a memorandum and kind of, perfect it so that way when they get to be lieutenant, new lieutenants, that they'll be able to, show up and look like they're been in the Air Force their whole life. So
Exactly. Yep.
yeah, absolutely. But I guess leading into my next question here, I know that you kind of just pressed on it before, but it sounds like you've gotten to meet some quite high ranking officers and even at one point worked with the chief of staff in the Thunderbirds. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. I was very fortunate. Again, it was when I was at Clark. A lot of things happened to me at 3.5 years at Clark. My boss came in, a lieutenant colonel who's the commander of the weather unit, and asked me if I want to volunteer for a special duty. The squadron wants me to do a special deployment. And the last time that I had that presented to me, we were sending one of our enlisted forecasters off to Saudi Arabia. And this was before we had a very big president in Saudi Arabia for 6 months. And I thought, oh no, they're going to send me to Saudi. And he told me that I was the squadron, the weather squadron wanted to have me be the weather officer for the Air Force's Thunderbirds tour out through the Pacific. They're very concerned about the typhoons. They wanted a weather officer who had some knowledge about typhoons, who had worked with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, and who had also had deployed to many of the countries that they were going to. Well, I got the opportunity to do that. And in that, we actually deployed to and did a show in Beijing, China. And when I was in Beijing, China, of course, that was one of the first times the Thunderbirds performed in China. And the chief of actually was the secretary of the Air Force, this highest ranking civilian in the Air Force. He was there along with his Chinese counterpart. And I got to meet both of them. They were both in the weather briefing that I gave the Thunderbird team for the show. And it was fortunate because the day before, the weather was really lousy. It was below the minimums that they would have had to cancel the show. Fortunately, working with the Chinese forecasters there at Beijing, we were able to determine that cold front that I had been watching and telling the Thunderbirds, no problem, it's going to come through. It's going to clear out the haze and the smoke. And it did. And we were able to perform the show on schedule for the Chinese people.
Wow, that's really impressive. And it actually luckily leads into our next question. So, with being a weather officer and having the high amounts of stressors that you do, how do you keep your cool? And what is very important to you staying organized as a weather officer?
I learned this from my very first commander. He was a really cool and level-headed commander. He had been a commander of weather units in Vietnam and several other locations. So I learned a lot from him. And I realized that if you kind of keep the cool, you can kind of keep everything under control there. I remember one time because as a young officer, you don't get to see a lot of the stuff in school, and you see your very first tornado on radar. You kind of get excited just because you're a meteorologist and that's what we do. He had called up and, I guess I sounded a little too excited about my reporting of a radar sighted tornado and my first tornado warning I issued for the base. So he came in and he thought I was under some kind of stress or something. I said, no, I was just excited about this is my first time by myself issuing a tornado warning and seeing it on radar. And it was just, one of those professional things that you have to do.
Yeah.
So I learned from there that you have to kind of be able to mentor or hold down your excitement and so forth. Also, like you said, there's just so much work you have to do, and it doesn't matter whether you're a weather officer, acquisition officer, comm officer, pilot. There's a lot more work to do than you really have time. And you've probably already seen this as cadets, especially going off to summer. Well, we called it summer camp. It's your field training.
I wouldn't consider it camp, but it's it's definitely a nice little trip away. That's for sure.
Yeah, you learn a lot about the stress there and the amount of work you have to do in such a short amount of time. You have to learn how to be organized and know what's important to do now and what can be kind of pushed off to later times that you can then work on those. So you kind of set up priority systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it has a basis of training as well. Your training kind of falling back onto that when you are stressed out. And it can be applied to being a weather officer or any other career field in the Air Force. When you've been trained very well and you have a lot of knowledge, it in situations, especially for you, like, you saw your first tornado. I don't blame you. I'd probably be even more excited. And he would be like, you just need to calm down, Lieutenant. But it's just like, you fall back on your training, whether or not it's good stress or bad stress, and just keeping that calm, level-headed mentality so that way you don't make any mistakes and your training kind of just shines through. And it also is experience as well. I mean, the more of those stressful situations that you're put into, I'm sure it was much different from when you started a lieutenant all the way to when you were retiring at lieutenant colonel. I don't think that there was anything that could really phase you now versus when you were first starting out, and that's experience as well.
But even as a young officer, because you're working as a team with the enlisted and civilian, your demeanor and how you approach it will also then rub off on your rest of your team. If you're, real lackadaisical, or you get excited and you jump the gun on doing things and get too excited, or seem unsure, your team will also become that way. So it's real important that you set the example in leadership.
Absolutely. And you're really good, Mr. Springer, about leading into my next questions, but we do have a question about leadership and I guess certain qualities that you looked for in, yourself, and kind of like the difficulties that you went through kind of gaining that experience. And I guess like for your leadership, what is very important for you as a leader?
Well, my mantra that I always went in to any unit, whether it was my very first unit or my very last unit, I always wanted to go in and make a difference to the unit, make the unit and the people in that unit a little better, whether it's professionally or some kind of new equipment, new procedures. But I always look for ways to try to improve the unit somehow. And that also kind of is a double-edged sword because, sometimes that's very difficult because of the situation. And if your expectations are too high and you can't have other people meet it, then there's, I don't know if the word disappointment's right, or you can start having morale issues. So you have to kind of temper your wanting to improve and change things to help the unit and the people within the unit without being overbearing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying is you're not doing anything maliciously. You're doing it to try to improve the status quo and make it easier for everybody else too. And I mean, I'm sure, work ethic is also a big deal about, it has a lot to do with that as well. Your work ethic kind of shows like whether or not, you're trying to just advance yourself or advance your team. And people, especially the enlisted, they pick up on that,
Mm-hmm.
And especially in your job and in the job that I'm going to and other jobs across the Air Force, you kind of have to rely on your enlisted to have your back and provide you, high quality, either reports or materials or whatever their job is, and kind of like trusting them to do their job. And, it's just, if you have that toxic environment, then it doesn't make it for a good unit. But people know. I mean, people will know whether or not you're just doing it for yourself or if you're doing it for them. So that's very important. I think a lot of us, we forget, especially right now, because as cadets, we're kind of, we're really responsible for ourselves right now.
Mhm.
And we're responsible for our own advancement. We have our AFOQT that we have to do. We have PT standards that we have to meet. And of course, if your flight's doing well, you're going to do well as well. And then you have your commander's ranking. So a lot of that is person based.
Mhm.
It's not really, they try to emphasize it's on teamwork as well. But, even if you're really, really good, you could still make it quite far, even if you have a flight that's a little bit lacking. And so I know as a POC, when I've seen, somebody that's just trying to advance themselves, I'm like, pull them aside. I'm just like, hey, you need to be worried about the team effort too, because, you might be really, really good as a cadet, but you need to focus on helping your flight as well. And that sounds like a lot of what happens in the weather officer sector is that as well. So.
Yep. And we depend on other career fields as well. As I was talking to you earlier today, before we set this Zoom meeting up, is, it's not just the weather team, but we depend on like the comm computer officers. As you can see, there's a lot of technology that we use. And many times when I deployed forward, I would be working with comm and computer officers to try and enlisted, trying to get just basic information in through the various comm networks. So, and we had a little hiccup on our Zoom here. Same thing, you always have to depend on someone, so you can't do the job by yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my next question to you is that with your job being such a high stress career field, how do you handle being overwhelmed? How do you handle your emotions and kind of being that authority figure in the room, especially with you meeting with such higher ranking people at sometimes?
Well, there's an advantage of being a weather officer because unfortunately or fortunately, I guess, weather takes a beating from just about everyone, from the pilots to the command staff. So you kind of have to have a little sense of humor. And you could kind of, if you approach it right, I remember I had one director of operations, a full colonel. He was kind of a tough guy. I don't think I ever remember seeing him smile, but occasionally if I would get a quick one in, like we had a Typhoon Hope and it was heading toward us in December, a couple of days before Christmas. And it was a long typhoon season. And the colonel asked a good question. Do you think this thing's really going to come to us? And I was just so exhausted. I hope not. And I didn't realize what I just said. And he began to smile. And I realized that he caught an unintended pun. And of course, the entire staff laughed and that. So it broke up the tension of a very long typhoon season right before Christmas and that. So sometimes that sense of humor, sometimes you have to take it, that, you're wrong. And, I'm going to just get beat up for it and that. So, and just keeping things in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So with you in your weather unit, I mean, you kind of touched on it already, but you were overwhelmed in this situation. Everybody was tired, and it sounds like your team was probably just as equally as tired as you. So for, not just the weather officer career field, but in other career fields, how do you boost morale within your unit? What is your go-to when it comes to just making everybody happy again or feel like they're appreciated?
Well, I don't know about happy, but at least appreciated and just some relaxed time. I know when I was squadron commander, one of the things we used to do is we would shut down early on Friday, about once a quarter. We had a special balloon site on the other side of the base that had a volleyball court, and had a barbecue grill. So we would just literally, pare it down to, only essential personnel, which was like one person. on that Friday, because we would tell all the flyers that, hey, if you need us, we'll be around. But, otherwise, we're going to be over having a picnic. And just having something like that really does kind of gives everyone a chance to kind of get out of the uniform, relax, and get to know each other, and just have some fun. And a lot of the units would do that throughout my career. And it wouldn't just necessarily be sand volleyball. Sometimes it'd be just going out over to the O Club, or going to a ball game or something like that.
Yeah. So, that's really good. And it sounds like you knew your people. So on average, how many people do you think that you worked with, a lower enlisted, even to GS employees? Because a lot of us, we actually don't know how many civilians we will work with in our career full time. So I guess, what's the dynamics there? How is that different than, does it create an imbalance, or how do you handle working with, you guess, from your enlisted to your GS employees that you have?
Okay. Well, I was fortunate when I was at St. Louis doing my basic meteorology training. The captain, she told us, when you get out to your first duty station, find a civilian or a senior NCO, and they're going to show you the ropes as a second lieutenant. I was fortunate. My mentor was a civilian who had been at Kelly Air Force Base for a long time. He was a retired senior master sergeant with about 28 years of service. So if he didn't know it, no one knew it. Yeah. And he took me under his wing. So there I learned that the civilian workforce really provides a very stable and a very informative source of information, especially for a new lieutenant.
Yeah. And we have 30
you
of
have to be careful, because some of the civilians know that you're a new lieutenant and they'll try to play tricks on you. I remember my first forecast that I put together myself. It was on the computer screen, and I asked the civilian, my mentor, George, to take a look at it. And so I turned around and did some other work. I turned around and the screen was blank. And he was kind of a gruff kind of guy usually. And I thought, man, if he didn't like my forecast, he could have just said so. He didn't have to delete it.
Oh, no.
And of course, being a lieutenant, I was afraid to ask him. And I could just see him over there sitting in his chair. He began to smile. Then he began to chuckle. I said, okay, George, what's up? He didn't tell me that you could scroll the screen up and down.
Oh, no.
So he was a great guy. He loved to play those practical jokes. But he also taught me so much. So when I had civilians
too,
and I had civilians who were my bosses, and same thing, they taught me so much about how to do the acquisition part of the job, where you can kind of press people for the hard questions to get the answer without being insubordinate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it looks like our time is running out, but do you have any closing remarks or any small stories that you kind of want to share with our cadets that are kind of going into field training this summer, and our new lieutenants, that we have 30 of them that are being commissioned?
Yeah. For those who are going off the field training, hang in there. Remember, this is part of the test. The Air Force is looking at you and you're looking at the Air Force. So it's a two-way look. So take your training that you've had and your preparation for field training seriously, and good luck. For those who are getting commissioned, congratulations. Congratulations. You're starting a new adventure. You don't know where you're going to end up. When I got commissioned, I did not plan to have a 25-year career. I thought, well, I'll do 4 and I'll see what it's like. And then they gave me a better assignment and a better assignment. And then when I got to 20, I thought, well, I'll get out at 20 with my wife, because it's been kind of working the joint spouse. Then they keep offering better assignments each time.
Yeah.
So it's an adventure. So take advantage of it. Don't say no to assignments.
Absolutely.
Make the assignments. Do a good job.
Well, I'm sure that they will definitely take that. And I'm sure they're really hoping that their jobs will be looking as exciting as this one. Well, again, Mr. Springer, I just wanted to thank you so much for meeting with us, especially last minute. And, to all the cadets that are watching, we really appreciate your perspective, not just as a weather officer, but as a regular officer within the Air Force, and kind of teaching us, and giving us examples about being versatile and caring about your people and, just different leadership qualities that we could definitely build upon, and we will build upon in the Air Force. And I'm sure some of them will look back and remember the stories that you told us. They might not remember your name, but they'll remember the substance to it. But again, Mr. Springer, retired Lieutenant Colonel Springer, I really appreciate your time. And we just want to thank you here at Detachment 842 for meeting with us.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It was fun.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well,
just like everything in the Air Force, you make anything fun if you try.
Yes, sir. And is there like an email address if any of our cadets have that you would like them to reach out to if they have any questions?
Sure. I can use my UIW email address.
Yes, sir.
So it's T Springer with dropping the R. So it's T Spring with an E at the end, I guess, is another way to look at it, at uiwtx.edu.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Springer, again, and out to everybody in our cadet that's watching in our audience. Thank you so much for coming here today again, and I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Don't get too stressed out by all those finals.
Everyone have a good weekend.
Thank you, sir. You too. You can log off whenever you're ready.
All right.